Yes. And with the button pressed for recording this webinar, my name is Andrew Peterson. A big thank you for joining us today. We're just welcoming in people from the waiting room and also welcoming a few also a few of our panelists as well. We already have one, but we're expecting a couple more. So if you bear with us just for about another 30 seconds, do what I did, went and go to the toilet, grab a cup of tea, come back. If you can do that in 30 seconds, you're much better at it than I am. And with that, I should shut up. All right. So, and there is Chris Foley, and we welcome Chris Foley. Alerting Chris Foley to the fact that we have started the webinar. And very good. All right, so let's kick off. And with that, I will open by, as we do always at BCSDA events, acknowledge that we are broadcasting to you. And today we are broadcasting to you from the land of the Camaragal people, and we acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. I'm going to have a chat today. I like to consider these a fireside chat rather than some overt and probably boring PowerPoint presentation by my good self and less other people, but certainly myself, to talk about the issue of the INC, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee on the Plastics Treaty. Now, this is a conversation that is in two parts, literally. We had the one last year, which was supposed to complete it, and we're going to have the one this year, which is supposed to complete it. And it's a very interesting moment in time to have a discussion in relation to, amongst other things, a treaty on pollution and plastics because of the geopolitical situation and the conversation, obviously, around impact of tariffs and just the broader question as to whether or not multilateral agreements will actually find their way forward in the short term at least. So today we're going to be, I'm going to give you a quick briefing on what we're hearing, both in terms of context and in current status. And then we're going to have a panel. Firstly, we're going to be welcoming Chris Foley from the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation. Hopefully Lisa McLean will find a button to come in and join us, she being the CEO of Circular Australia. And a big surprise, Hannah Scott-Evans, the sustainability lead for South Pacific from Colgate-Palmolive, who is a time-honoured BCSD member and has been working on a lot of the work that the WBCSD has been doing in relation to the Circularity Protocol. But first, let's just jump back to context. So to remind those who probably haven't kept up to what happened, when it happened, why it happened. And this was the United Nations Environment Programme negotiations that were held in Busan in South Korea late in 2024. In fact, they were part of a smorgasbord of conversations that were happening last year at an international multilateral agreement. We had the negotiations at Baku in Azerbaijan for climate change. We had the negotiations on COP16 in relation to the United Nations Framework Convention on Biological Diversity. And interestingly, because of sequence and cycling, we also had the Convention on Combating Desertification. But we also had this one. Now, this is not a COP technically. In fact, it's the pre-COP. It's a conversation you have before you have a COP, in the sense that you are determining whether or not there is going to be the appetite for intergovernmental multilateral conversation around a particular topic. And in this case, it's about the question of whether or not, as it says on the page, to develop an international legal binding instrument on plastics pollution, including that in the marine environment. A couple of interesting proof points. The plastics currently occupy or account for, rather, 5% of all greenhouse gas emissions, which was a really interesting report the Lawrence Berkeley Lab issued last year, just prior to the 5.1 negotiations of the INC. and in it identified that production of plastic was going to at least double by 2050, at least double. And then I found that this a really interesting infographic this week, thanks to Visual Capitalist. It was actually produced in 2024, early in 2024, about how long does plastic take to decompose? And if you have a look at it, it is quite stunning. I had not appreciated the length of time it takes. It almost takes as long to find the decomposition of uranium in some respects. Perhaps not the right analogy, but interesting that cigarette butts, which I had not appreciated, do have a presence of, what is it, cellulose acetate, which is a plastic that can take years to break down. And it says it takes 5 years, no less. The one that really jumped out at me, though, were diapers, toothbrushes, and styrofoam, which, according to the analysis that was provided, take up to 500 years to decompose. So with the notion of these plastics being ubiquitous within our current system, obviously the call for and the need for something to address this became of utmost urgency. And the notion of having why there were five, what's the secret or the importance of the number five in all of this? It's the fifth time they met, ostensibly, to try and find an agreement in relation to how they were going to move forward on an international or multilateral agreement. And in that regard, the report that we gave in, I think, early December of last year was that there was a basis for future negotiations. It could have stopped there, but it didn't. There was a consensus then at that time that it needed to find a scope of work and that there needed to be further discussion because it had not concluded. And so we have this notion of the commitment to resuming INC 5, not to have INC 6, because there's no mandate for that, but to have another or second part to these negotiations. Secondly, that there was a recognition of progress. And this is important because without it, there is no purpose for having these negotiations, and that there was consensus of less contentious issues, both in terms of information exchange, so what you would call ostensibly education, public awareness campaigns, again, education, but also, interestingly, the commitment to a conference of the parties. Now, you've heard that language before. If you're intimate with what goes on in climate negotiations and biodiversity negotiations and desertification negotiations, it's the same language and therefore the same apparatus or framework was being anticipated. So there was a commitment to a continuing engagement and that it would reconvene as quickly as possible in 2025. The thing that didn't happen, though, was the thing that now requires the 5.2, which was there is no scope of the treaty. There is no chair's text that tells us what the size of the prize looks like in terms of what a treaty will commit to. And this so-called absence of a definitive article on scope in the chair's text, as was published last year, remains the biggest point of contention. How long, how wide, how deep, how far are we going to be talking about? The other was, and this was true also of the biodiversity negotiations, how does this get paid for? In other words, what are the financial mechanisms that are going to be put in place to ensure that whatever is committed to is actually acted upon, both in terms of technical innovation, but just as importantly, in terms of capital markets, government commitment to public sector investment in relation to the work that would take to innovate and eliminate plastics wherever humanly possible pursuant to this agreement. Now, what happened was, and this happened also in the biodiversity agreement, was a disagreement around whether they should establish a new fund, a dedicated multilateral fund, or use existing mechanisms. It's interesting that Australia was very much of the view that it should use existing mechanisms. So that was the Australian standpoint. The African group proposals were notably excluded from the latest chair's text, meaning that Africa actually proposed a multilateral fund. And so we had this lack of consensus about where to move forward. Now, interestingly, and if you were a BCSDA member, you will have seen this already, but we've been tracking what's going on in terms of the negotiations over the last few months, ever since the 5.1 concluded. And quite interestingly, between Easter and Anzac Day, so far as Australians are concerned, there was actually a meeting that was held, a pre-negotiation round that was held in Geneva, which provided some really interesting insights into developments after INC 5.1 and what could happen at INC 5.2, which is proposed to be in Geneva in August later this year. It's helpful to note that there was a commitment to these so-called core treaty priorities. In other words, the need to phase out harmful plastics products and chemicals, reduce plastic production to sustainable levels, and you can guess that's a definitional challenge in itself, and how you then ensure financial mechanism for implementation. Obviously, the challenges remain the same, and in fact, they've been added to because we see that the United States, which was one of the key parties involved in the negotiations at 5.1, is no longer present. It is withdrawn its interest in participating as a party to it, although it still sits on the sidelines, as I understand it, interested in understanding where it's going. But the discussion remains the debate over whether there should be global or national measures. In other words, should be either a top-down approach or a bottom approach. And you can see where that has happened in the past in relation to climate negotiations, for example. There's equally a strong deliberation around voluntary and mandatory obligations. And for what it's worth, there's now a question mark about securing the political will for these major commitments. So there's no sense that the meeting won't happen, but there is a strong question mark as to whether or not there will be adequate will by parties to actually find a consensus going forward. Interestingly, though, what's called the intersessional engagement, in other words, what happens between all of these meetings, is still going on. So there's a lot of technical and procedural stuff that still happens. And our government, through the Department of Foreign Affairs and through the Department of Climate Change, are still engaged in technical aspects of those items that could actually find their way into the ultimate treaty agreement. So the things that we wanted to highlight around what to watch for, I think were fourfold. Yes. Firstly, plastics and chemicals of concern. So there's a strong momentum, ironically, from everybody for phasing out of the most harmful plastic products and chemicals that are presently on market. So that's quite interesting, and that may well lead to at least some form of some agreement occurring. There is an ongoing disagreement, let's not call it debate, over chemical transparency and traceability, with industry concerns about supply chain implications, probably magnified now as a result of what's happening around the world in relation to tariffs, impositions. The one I think that is encouraging to see, because it's been a bit of a dog's breakfast for some time, is this need to align the existing Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm conventions to ensure a real harmonisation and synergy across these multilateral agreements that have been in place for a number of years but don't necessarily talk to one another, and in some cases actively disagree with one another. So the time for synthesis is clearly about to happen. In terms of sustainable production and product design, this is a really interesting one, because there was a massive debate about whether or not this would go ahead at all. But now there seems to be support for global plastic production reduction targets led by both Rwanda and Mexico. And this has been brought forward in a discussion that's now happening at a technical level for some what's called a non-paper. In other words, nobody owns the ideas, but here are some that could be used for a further discussion. There is ongoing technical discussion on eco design standards and EPR, and hopefully we'll hear both from Chris and also Lisa, particularly in relation to what the Australian circumstance is of that. And then we're seeing from other quarters, particularly industry, a pressure to focus on advanced recycling and waste management rather than upstream production limits. Now, this doesn't necessarily accord with what's called the High Ambition Coalition, and that could well be a point of pain that will occur during the negotiations. In terms of the finance mechanism and its implementation, there is still a debate going on whether there will be funding will be mandatory or voluntary, with implications for developing countries to actually implement treaty obligations in the absence of. So under the climate negotiations, under the climate framework, you have something called the GEF, the Global Environment Facility. One argument is it could be actually expanded and used for the purpose of financing mechanisms for developing countries in relation to this particular potential treaty. There are proposals on the table for dedicated multilateral funds versus the existing structure. As I say, like the GEF, we'll wait to see what happens. There is a genuine concern around the private sector contributions and producer fees, as some countries are pushing for industry accountability. And again, we may well hear something further from both Chris and Lisa in relation to that. Finally, the issue of governance and compliance, which is an important one because of what's happening in the world at the moment. The call for a unique scientific body and then national reporting mechanisms and an implementation committee to monitor the treaty effectiveness mirror exactly what's happened in relation to climate and what's happened in relation to biodiversity. Some argue that that is duplication. I sit in both fences, on both fences, which makes me very uncomfortable. But it's interesting to see that there's a logic to having it discrete, but there's also a logic to having it interconnected. And so it will be, I think, one of those things that needs to be well and truly looked at from a cost-effective basis. If you set up another body, if you have the implementation process that the IPCC does, for example, for climate and IPBES does for biodiversity, all very worthwhile, but they take a lot of time to collect data, bringing that forward, it to be debated, and then for it to be utilised. And the question is, do we have that kind of time? This notion of and the option around a so-called treaty of the willing approach as opposed to a binding framework with progressive protocols, which is similar to MARPOL. And if anybody's familiar with the treaty on the pollution or the prevention of pollution by ships, will know that MARPOL has a unique framework that sets up various protocols rather than necessarily targets, and ships have to adhere to that. Whereas the so-called treaty of the willing approach is actually Australia is in that. And so it'll be interesting to see which one ends up being has primacy in relation to the negotiations from a governance point of view. And then, of course, we have the question mark about the US position and its ripple effect in relation to geopolitical shifts. There's no sense that this yet has had the same impact. The US position has had the same impact that it may have in relation to climate, where other countries that are like-minded to the US may not continue their commitment under the Paris Agreement, but it could well happen here as well, in which case it ends up eroding the effectiveness of a multilateral outcome. But from our point of view at BCSDA, in communicating to our members, we think that there are some important things to be alive to. We do think that business should prepare for a stricter global rulemaking environment on plastics production, chemicals and EPR schemes, both in Australia but also elsewhere, even if they are not in every single jurisdiction. The treaty's direction, we think, will shape certain investment risks and opportunities, particularly with those companies that prioritise circular economy models, and I'm hoping Lisa will echo that. The regulatory alignment across jurisdictions, however, will be absolutely critical. And this is one interesting thing that Tanya Plibersek, as the then Environment Minister, and I'm only saying that because we don't know what's going to happen until after the 3rd of May, made it very clear that there needed to be alignment across every single jurisdiction so that you found least cost policy harmonisation wherever possible. And then finally, that this engagement with policymakers and coalitions continues to remain essential to ensure that the industry concerns are integrated into the treaty provisions. So what's next? What's coming up? Well, between now and July, the intersessional discussions continue. We expect to see some new chairs draft texts sometime land in May or June after the feedback from INC5 and the intersessionals. And then, of course, there's then the debate and deliberation that will occur in Geneva between the 5th to the 13th of August. All right, so enough of me bleating on, and I will close that down and we'll come back to our panel and welcome into the discussion Chris Foley. I've got to see if Lisa's actually, I'm wondering if she's actually, nope, we haven't seen her yet. So there'll be a very intimate discussion between Hannah, Chris, and myself. So we welcome Chris, we welcome Lisa in absentia, and we welcome Hannah Scott Evans. So, Chris, I would welcome some thoughts from you, and let me be transparent by indicating to everybody who doesn't know that I sit on the board of the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation as the Skills Director, appointed by the board. I've enjoyed my relationship with APCO for many a year, but I thought I'd get it from the person who's actually running the organisation rather than me pretending to understand at any given moment what's going on in the apparatus of packaging in this country, and particularly understand where APCO is at and where you think that the status of plastics packaging is at in Australia as at Monday, the 28th of April at 4:22 p.m. Chris.
Thank you, Andrew, and everybody. So I'm not going to present any slides, but I'll just run you through initially some sort of fun facts just to help set the scene from an Australian point of view. And some of the numbers are a bit scary and a bit confronting, and you go, oh my God, there's so much to do. But equally, there is a lot happening. So in the context of countdown to INC, it's really timely, and certainly thanks for the opportunity. As far as the current scale of plastics in Australia, in the context of packaging, it's about 50% of the plastics that are put on the Australian market is from plastic, and about half of that, more than half of that comes from offshore. So as far as the total packaging, to put it in numbers, in 22-23, which is the most recent reporting period, it was just over 7 million tonnes. That's about 18% of all packaging placed on market, or about 1.26 million tonnes. Only 19% of the plastic was recycled or composted, which is and it's actually dropped back a percentage on the year before. For the first time, though, which is really interesting, plastic intensity fell, this is per person, from 269 kilos to 264 per person, but it's in line with some of the comments that Andrew made. It's forecast to grow and be rising moving forward. The big issue, the big challenge is probably no surprise to those in the know. Flexible plastics, they are our critical gap. So soft plastics and other flexible plastics, there's about 5.5 million. There's about 550,000 tonnes, or about 43% of all plastic is flexible. It's only got a recovery rate of 6%, and so it's got a recovery rate of 6%, but about 11% is considered technically recyclable. So the issue is there's been a lot of investment, particularly by APCO brand owners, in improved recyclability, improved recoverability, but the systems and processes aren't there. And post-consumer recycled content's currently 1%. So massive opportunity. Domestic reprocessing can treat about 10% of flexible plastics that are placed on the market. So no surprise in Australia's manufacturing state. And I'll talk a bit more about capacity coming on in a second. As far as how we sort of evaluate, how we monitor progress, we've got national packaging targets. They were set in 2018. There are 4 of them designed for recovery, and 86% of all packaging is now considered reusable, recyclable, or compostable. That's up 2 points from the previous year. Recycling rates, I spoke briefly about this, plastic stuck at 19%, which is far short of the 70% target. That target expires at the end of 2025. These targets, environment ministers are backing them in and just saying, well, these targets provide a North Star. Just because they're not being reached by the due date of 2025, it doesn't mean that they're going to be pulled they will continue until ministers determine otherwise. Recycled content, average post-consumer recycled content occurring in store materials is 44%. I mentioned rigid plastics is at 14% and flexibles are at 1%. Big opportunity to improve there. On a positive note, problematic items, single-use plastic bags in particular, have almost largely been removed from market. Not fully, but there's been a big effort on that by retailers over many years. Just from a policy and investment pipeline point of view, really encouraging work. The environment ministers have committed to national packaging regulation and things like establishing national design standards, mandated recycle requirements for recycled content, mandated data reporting, the concept of a mandated label, the concept of mandated packaging targets, all of which is great. Probably the defining, a really key piece here is that the states and territories have acknowledged that having a fragmented approach where each state and territory at the moment is responsible for packaging packaging regulation, you could argue. We are a federation of states, and that's not working. So you've got national brand owners, some of you will be in that space. So the states and territories have said, yep, we get it. We're happy to move this into a federal regime. We are currently waiting for the reform agenda of the Commonwealth to be released and obviously endorsed by the states and territories. But it is happening, it is coming. We've obviously had a federal election get in the way, but it is also delayed by circa 12 months. Within the background, the show goes on, and on behalf of our members and industry, in August last year, we developed through our board a 2030 strategic plan, which flags the introduction of things like extended producer responsibility fees to F27 that will evolve into eco-modulated fees over time. They're designed to really drive sustainable packaging being placed on market, but also deliver the funds that can then be invested in the downstream system. I'll talk about that in a sec. As far as investments, you've got the Recycling Modernisation Fund. So the federal government's putting $20 million towards a project in Kilburn, South Australia. That was towards a $40 million facility with a capacity that will be able to palletize up to 14,000 tonnes of soft plastic annually. My understanding is that's being activated at the moment to go live, hopefully in July at some scale. You've also had $15.5 million invested in Victorian projects. There are 3 projects around soft plastics. They're expected to divert 43,000 tonnes of material annually in coming years. Just recently, Viva Energy and Cleanaway, they've got an advanced soft plastic recycling project. They've completed pre-feasibility. They're moving to the next stage. That'll be Australia's first large-scale pyrolysis food-grade facility. Exciting, complicated, significant capital investment required. But it is exciting that that's actually on the cards still, and then moving to the next stage. Just from other infrastructure beyond flexible plastic, you've got Circular Plastics Australia. They've got 2 facilities, one at Albury and one at Altona North. That's a collaboration of a number of businesses: Asahi, Coke, Packed Packaging, Cleanaway. It just shows trying to solve for some of these problems does require collaboration, even amongst competitors. Another example of innovation is Licella. They've got an advanced recycling project down in Vic. EPA approvals in place. They're looking to process 20,000 tonnes and be scalable up to 120,000 tonnes. Again, the challenge here is the economics, which is why we're looking at EPR fees and eco-modulated fees moving forward. I think on the consumer and public sentiment front, it's really interesting that we know that consumers want it to be true. That was part of the problem with RedCycle. Trust took a massive hit with the demise of RedCycle, but everybody, whether it be the consumer at home, it was basically oversubscribed. We all wanted it to be true. There's obviously a big backstory to that. What we do know from Clean Up Australia is that their 2024 litter audit shows that plastics are slightly above 80% of collected items. One of the Strengths of plastic is that it's lightweight, it's durable, it doesn't degrade. One of the downsides is it's lightweight, it's durable, and it doesn't degrade. It doesn't go anywhere if it lands in the environment in the wrong space. Our challenge is how do we create circular systems for it? Because there are applications, particularly for packaging, where it does have superior performance. We know that from an APCO point of view, the Australasian recycling labels on more than 500,000 products. Independent trials have shown that confusion about the disposal of packaging drops by about 30% where a label's present on packaging, a behaviour change label. And a proof point for them, what's interesting then is that we know that about 70% of rigid plastic that leaves a household, 70% of that rigid plastic is recyclable, but is going into the wrong bin. So it's going into landfill bin, should be going to the curbside bin. That's a behaviour change. That's an education opportunity, which we have to seize. Just touching on what success requires, there's probably I think four call outs from myself. One's clearly in sort of the numbers I've rattled off before. There's an infrastructure gap. We don't have the domestic manufacturing capacity or capability at the moment. That's a massive economic challenge. The business case needs to stack up. We can't expect the downstream system, the collectors, the sorters, the recyclers, and the reprocessors to do it just because it's great for the environment. We need to create the economic demand drivers. That's where certainly APCO's 2030 strategy kicks in, where we're proposing revenue from new eco-modulated fees will be used to, one, incentivise better packaging design outcomes, but two, provide the funds that can then be reinvested in the downstream system and drive outcomes like recycled content, which ultimately it actually all gets down to we can't just collect it and reprocess it. It's actually got to come back in. And that's where the demand gap is, as far as we've got to have end markets for everything that we reprocess. There's also a bit of a challenge around data, traceability, and how do you make it true? So when we talk about particularly the global markets, the movement of recycled content around the globe, it's going to happen, it'll continue to happen, it has to happen. We're not big enough. But how do we do that transparently so that brand owners can hand on heart report that they're compliant with new packaging design mandates, as an example of recycled content. So it's a bit of a whirlwind tour. I think some closing comments. We've certainly improved plastic packaging design. We know what's possible. We know, again, the reference to say rigid plastics, where 70% of rigid plastics at curbside are actually recyclable, but they're going to landfill. So there's been a lot of heavy lifting. The challenge is how do we tie off the back end of the system? The hard work really does lie in flexible plastics. That's the concept of scaling of chemical recycling, the driving of mechanical recycling, and the driving for end markets for those materials, either to come back in as packaging again, ideally, preferably. But if it's not packaging, then what's the highest order of a circular outcome for plastic? So we know that regulation's coming. We're in a bit of a hiatus at the moment. We've obviously got an election happening. As soon as we can get post-election certainty around who's in power and get the states and territories. We know the states and territories want it. That's hugely exciting. And we also know that brand owners, 80% of our members want mandated EPR. So they just want to know that it's transparent, it's fair and equitable, and that it takes this issue off the table for them. So that's a bit of a whirlwind tour of the state of the Australian market from a plastics point of view for packaging, Andrew.
Thank you for that whirlwind. I have to get my hair redone because it's just far too fast. And I shouldn't say that, given. Anyway, moving on. We welcome Lisa into this conversation, and in the opening, Lisa, I was highlighting the work of the INC up to the negotiations last year, but we also had a briefing on what's happened since then. And one of the interesting observations is the reference to circular economy has not just stayed in there, but it is now becoming an important part of the conversation, that those who are willing to be part of the conversation, conscious that since what's happened, since the last negotiations, we've seen the withdrawal of the United States as party to the negotiations, but those who are in are very much in, and that one of the elements to that was the observation that circular economy principles were fundamental to the way in which it would work. Now, that's important because at about the same time as the negotiations were happening last year, you were involved in a very important piece of work that was going on with the Australian government. And it'd be helpful to have a reminder of what that is, and from yourself at Circular Australia, but also to give any sense of what you've seen as progress on that narrative since the conclusion of the INC negotiations in early December of last year. Over to you.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Andrew, and great to be here with everybody to talking about this really important issue. So there has been a lot of progress. I think circular economy really since COVID, and for a lot of us who've been working in this space for some time, and certainly from Chris's perspective, from packaging, circularity is really being much more broadly understood now, where as it should be. And as a solution to a lot of national security issues, how do we actually also stay relevant from a trade perspective when 75% of our trading partners and the G20 have got circular economy strategies and emerging regulations and legislation, and knowing also that we are running out of critical minerals, but we're also increasing technomass on the planet versus biomass is shrinking, more technomass, more things that we actually don't use. So our circularity rate globally is sitting at 7.2%, which means more than 90% of the stuff that we're making is not being used. So circularity is really solving problems around productivity, around material efficiencies, securing critical minerals for growth, ensuring that we're not going to be a dumping ground for products, not just the packaging piece, but everything else, products that can't be recycled, can't be repaired, can't be broken down at end of life, and are costly to do so. So we've really seen circular economy coming into sort of, a solutions framework for the triple planetary crisis, which is certainly where it needs to be. So in Australia, yes, over the last 2 years, under the leadership of Tanya Plibersek and Cabinet, a ministerial advisory group was set up called the CMAG, Circular Economy Ministerial Advisory Group, chaired by John Thwaites. And we interviewed about and heard from about 200 organisations and peak bodies. And we came up with 14 recommendations, which were released in our report, the Circular Advantage report, last year in December. And they included a new framework for circularity, which, by the way, was also launched at the same time in response by Tanya Plibersek, and that looked at doubling our circularity rate, which is pretty low. We're sitting around 4%, so we're even lower than the international average. But it looked at doubling that, improving materials efficiency, and getting resources out of waste streams. And so it set some good targets around that. That was one of our recommendations. Another recommendation was the Productivity Commission inquiry, which many of you would know, on circular economy, which is underway. It's put out an interim report a month ago, and the final report will be picked up shortly. So really understanding its role to build to some of the points Chris raised around how do we build onshore manufacturing capability, how do we participate in a circular economy, and that how does that relate to Made in Australia, how does that relate to getting the residual value of waste streams and products that are currently going offshore and into landfill. And Circular Australia also did a report on some resources last year, We looked at PET plastics. We also looked at lithium and green steel and, among other things, textiles and a few other things. And there's massive opportunities. Lithium, for example, it's a $3 billion economic opportunity if we can actually harvest some of these really important waste streams, and PET is no different from that. So the Productivity Commission report, I'd urge you to have a look at it, and it's going to come up with its framework and recommendations in a couple of months. We also have asked for, this is a ministerial advisory group, also asked government to set up a Circular Economy Act. And that piece of legislation, it's legislating for the future. It would replace waste legislation. And Andrew, we would love to work with you and your members and those attending today to be signing up to pushing this act. Once we do know who's, regardless of who's in government after the election, we'd like to really push that legislation, because that's the way we really start to get the right signals to develop markets. Out of that will shake down regulation around design, repair, and also the product stewardship piece that Chris has talked about. There's a number of other recommendations there around place-based circularity. How do we, really support that transformation and attach, not just build the infrastructure, but get these repair jobs and get the safe places to actually process waste streams, including complex plastics, and so that there's no fires and other things. And they're actually, being able to activate new business models, and products can be developed out of those waste streams. So place-based circularity is super important. Of course, the First Nations piece is great because circular economy really is synergistic with First Nations approaches to economic management and caring for country. So there's lots of opportunities there as well. The innovation piece is massive, and what we've asked for is funding for innovation for new business models and to scale circular solutions, for example, as a service models. You will have been familiar with those. There's very successful examples of mobility as a service, lighting as a service, energy as a service. And we know examples like companies like Caterpillar that have tractors and things have always owned the residual value of their assets. And what it means is that they can take them back at end of life, break them down like Lego, put them into new products. It can lower the price point for consumers and also increase revenue for businesses. So there are lots of successful stories and examples across sector of circular business models that can really solve these complex problems. So they're just some examples, Andrew. I think the framework is also really important for people to look at, that the federal government's just launched, as I mentioned, with those targets. And that also dovetails in with the state and territory governments' targets of creating circular economy markets by 2030. The framework is actually looking at targets for 2035. So, really, it's just terrific that we've got this movement. And we also know that the recommendations that were made through our Circular Advantage report very much reflects industry's desires for action. As Chris was saying, it really is being driven by industry. So that's quite hard to unpick for a new administration. There's strong momentum. It's in our trade agreements. Circularity has actually been a trade pillar for most states for the last 5 to 7 years, especially when you look at Europe and some of the bigger trading partners we have there, like the Netherlands. I think where circular economy is obviously really important. So the framework that the federal government has released, which was in December last year, is to shrink our per capita material footprint by 10%, to double our circularity by 2035, lift our material productivity by 30%, and also, really safely recover that massive amount of resources, the 80% of resources that are just lost to us at the moment. So
Thanks.
a lot of momentum.
Thank you for that. And I was going to pick up on something you said earlier because I was going to use it as my segue, but I can't remember what it is now. I remember what it was. Um, it's interesting how the three of us as organisations representing um, parts of the system and the discussion in relation to that on behalf of members feel, in fact, enthused and enlivened by the of what is going on. But let's talk to somebody who's in the reality of this. And I remember what my segue was. You can't recycle toothpaste, but you can already recycle the container it's in. Can't you, Hannah?
You can, you can. It's definitely one of those big pieces of work carried out by Colgate. I think we've touched on, from Chris's point of view and Lisa's point of view as well, the importance of design standards and things, and to enable the recyclability of that container was definitely no small task. There was lots of years of R&D work, investment, and whilst that container is recyclable technically, there's still a job to be done in terms of that recyclable at scale and practicability. So it's definitely ongoing. Colgate's present in over 200 countries. I think across the world, it's a challenge to collaborate effectively to ensure that we do have that recyclability at practice across the globe, and confidently say, yes, we are recyclable, as in all of our toothpaste tubes. So we're still on a journey. And I think that's where it's, really important for a lot of this collaboration to come together, a lot of the regulations to come in place. I think for two reasons. One, to support the investment that's already happened. From a Colgate point of view, it's obviously a massive part of the portfolio being toothpaste. So that investment from years gone by may be one of the first to kind of move in terms of really large consumer packaging innovation to be recyclable, and one that presents a couple of hairy questions. Not everyone's on board. It presents change. Some recyclers are on board, some councils are on board, some are not on board. And that's very challenging to navigate as a brand, and particularly when you're not always having conversations with those people day to day. You do have to collaborate in different ways, which I know Lisa mentioned, and then partnerships like the one we have and membership with APCO becomes very important, and kicking off a lot of those conversations with new stakeholders and new collaborators. So we do continue on that journey to make sure that our tubes continue to be recyclable, because that kind of uniformity across the waste industry is something that it's imperative to ensure that we're very confident that a large part of our portfolio is recyclable. And that will be the same for so many other brands with their own difficult items and specific packaging. We can invest and think we're all doing the right thing, but we all collectively need to come together. And I think that, to my second point, that's where the regulation's really key. Yes, we've got that kind of internal tick, definitely internal. We still want to, strive for that really big external tick on the toothpaste tubes. But to the earlier slide that you pulled up, Andrew, with the toothbrushes, there's more in our portfolio. Like, there'll be more in many members' portfolios. So where we want to push for that change and those decisions now and in the short term internally to have the best outcomes, the regulations that come in place really help those kind of innovation design discussions now. We might have a 1 to 2 year innovation timeline process. So we're kind of making decisions now for things in 26, 27. And it's more difficult to have everyone internally on board. If we've got design and innovation in Hong Kong and the US and packaging in Thailand, technology in China, collectively, we might, as a very small country as well on our global scale, we're trying to push a voice for what we believe is right based on APCO's goals and what's coming up in the future for Australia. But that gets very tricky without kind of regulation and that key collaboration down to the waste industry to say, yes, we want to make these packaging changes because it's regulated in Australia, and also because we know it will be big tick recyclable technically, and also recyclable at scale and in practice, which is challenging, as we know from the tube. So it's important that we kind of strive for those kind of global rules, which is very much a part of the INC. And yeah, Colgate very much a supporter on that collaborative nature, because it impacts our everyday and those innovation conversations we have daily with those very broad teams who, you know, it's just local personnel in their own countries with very different conversations in regard to packaging and also product happening in their kind of markets. There's lots of stakeholders for us to get on board who are hearing very different viewpoints across, you know, Asia and also the world as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And all three of you talking about collaboration, and you kind of wonder, so isn't that what INC is about? It's about bringing together everybody to find that point of collaboration and the tipping point. Interesting expression, Andrew, around how you motivate the mindset to innovate and then find the financing for that innovation at scale. The question to the three of you, because you've all been talking about the collaboration between the various important constituents or stakeholders of this apparatus, this well, it is a linear apparatus, as Lisa will remind me. Is it such that it needs to move in conjunction with one another, or is there a trigger that you will see this to happen? And the reason why I'm going here is because Lisa makes the comment about Circular Economy Act. Well, that means that we lose the Katy Perry Act, which is the RAW Act. And so that's interesting, but that's not an act that's been around that long. And to suggest something like that is, I think, ambitious, it's robust, but do you think that there is the mindset amongst all the stakeholders to embrace that kind of, and not the act per se, but to embrace that kind of mindset change in an environment where we're faced at the moment with fractured globalization? Or do we wait and leave the negotiations for a period of time? Because that's one of the suggestions on the table. It's not the right moment to be doing it, because you won't get the outcomes that you want. Or do you, as Circular Australia is doing, as Colgate-Palmolive are doing, and as APCO and BCSDA is doing, you keep promoting it because you find that the mindset changes as a result of the engagement that you have? It's a very long question.
I might just jump in, and I think it's really interesting. And like, I've been in the role at APCO for 2.5, nearly 3 years. Prior to that, I was in retail for 9.5, working across a couple of Wesfarmers businesses, particularly around big box retail, and with Kmart and Target and ANCO and their global supply chains. But like the project with the humble Colgate tube is a cracking one where it's technically recyclable, but that came in just as I was arriving, and I just know how much time and investment globally that would have required. And I know from the work that we were doing across Kmart and Target and ANCO globally, these are ships, and you can't just pivot on a. So for industry, we really, and which is why, from an APCO point of view, people are going, "Oh my God, there's a federal election happening. What are you doing talking about EPR fees and eco-modulation and advancing this topic?" But it is a case of, it's actually beyond politics in many respects. We have to look at over the horizon. Like, businesses need to be thinking beyond just the political cycle, because if that was our mindset, nothing would happen. Because of the scale of the investment that's required. And in the context of plastics, which is why we're such advocates for the work that's happening through this initiative, we we're at the end of the supply chain as in Australia, and we have to be aligned. We have to, whether it's data standards, whether it's technical specifications, all of these things have to be in place. And I know Minister Plibersek, and I'm sure the states will be the same, is really adamant that we have to be aligned globally, and this is a fabulous high ambition alignment that will make life easy for Australian businesses. Because, and it's one of the challenges that I've got. We've got a team of three packaging technical experts in house, in fact, four, to try to make sure that what we're doing here aligns with global best practice because we're not big enough. And it's not just the manufacturing, it's actually just on every level, we have to be aligned globally. It's much bigger than any country.
And yet we are used to advantage of being off Broadway on occasion, if I can use this expression, of trialing. So Nestle and its work in relation to wraps have been very heavily using the Australian consumer to ascertain the uptake of the recycled wrapping. Hannah, what's just to take Chris's point about you can't wait for the politician cycle to actually get innovation occurring to address a challenge. I'm assuming that that's just axiomatic in a company like Colgate-Palmolive. Otherwise, you'd be waiting, much like the auto sector is now, crisis-ridden because it doesn't know should it go full EV, should it pull back and do EVs and hybrids and fossil fuel engined cars again. There's just no economic argument for investing and then pulling back from it, surely.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously from a tube point of view, the driver wasn't, political. It came in quite some time ago. The work was happening many, many moons ago. Because it's a big part of the portfolio and we needed to do something to improve that. And that was very testament to the company's purpose, which is kind of what it comes back to. It's not necessarily politically driven. Do some political decisions and regulations help with internal discussions? Definitely. It definitely helps sway some stakeholders. I think from an EPR perspective, that's definitely helped move things along, where those costs, they hit a line on the P&L and that kind of gets the attention of, the commercial stakeholders internally. But behind the scenes with packaging teams and product teams, it's much more about what we want to do for the planet of the future. It's integral. Otherwise, there'll be no one to kind of buy the products in the future. There'll be no
the future
planet left kind of thing.
Exactly.
Right. So there's definitely a line and there's definitely people internally that work authentically in that space. But of course, the kind of the regulations and the costs associated to each country, it's still important to bring a lot of the stakeholders collectively on board to act commercially and make sure that the business is still operating in the way that everyone wants, where the numbers come up.
I can just jump in really quickly because having worked a lot in the climate and carbon space prior, carbon and getting people to understand carbon 2010, whatever years ago, was very difficult. You couldn't see it. You couldn't understand it. I've told this story before, but I was in the Clinton Climate Initiative startup team in London, and we shared an office with the Carbon Disclosure Project. And there were two guys that just started this project, and they were so happy when two companies signed up to disclose their carbon. They didn't know what it was. It was terrifying for businesses because they couldn't understand it. Waste has people understand waste. Everybody understands it, from economists to households dealing with it every day. You don't have to have a degree or a doctorate or a science background to know what waste is. We need it to go. The economy needs to change. We know we're burning up and wasting stuff. So I always feel very optimistic, Andrew, about the transition to a circular economy. There's also lots of job opportunities in it, and it will connect in with our growth and made in Australia and our future economy narrative.
Okay, we've come up to 5, but I do want to go rapid fire answer to this question. What's the one thing you would like to see INC 5.2 come to a conclusion on or agree to? So I'll go first because it gives you time to think about it. I would like to see a very strong governance and compliance regime put in place. I don't think the coalition is enough. I do think it needs to be an overarching framework with targets being set and ideally interconnected and aligned with UNFCCC and UNCBD. Who wants to go next?
I mean, I was just going to say, you picked up a couple of things that have, from my point of view, totally. There's got to be targets, it's got to be more on the mandatory side than voluntary, to align at a national level each country, and drive outcomes like we've seen in climate. Otherwise, it's all for nothing.
Okay, Lisa?
Yeah.
Absolutely. It has to be, legally binding. It needs to be something that has achievable targets in there. It needs to be ambitious, but we absolutely must see it as mandated and beyond voluntary.
And last but not least, Hannah.
Yeah, sorry, probably not too much to add to that, but yeah, definitely from a mandatory perspective, global rules for global business is definitely kind of our stance.
I like that. Global rules for global business. That's where Australia wants to be. So with that, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all to those who joined online. Thank you to our speakers, Hannah, Chris and Lisa. Don't forget, this is first of two webinars that we're doing. The 100 days we've just done, and we'll do one 30 days before the actual event itself. And in that break, I think Lisa's going to the World Circular Economy Forum, so we'll have lots to talk about when she's there and when she gets back, and also what's coming up if there is a chair's text. Also, don't forget that BCSD Australia is hosting the chair of the ACCC at the Fiona Wayne oration on the 27th of May. She will be talking all things regulation and sustainability. We are very much looking forward to it. If you haven't registered, haven't got your ticket, can I encourage you to go onto our website and pick up those tickets as quickly as possible, because they are starting to go very quickly. For now, thank you so much for joining us. Andrew Peterson is my name, and see you somewhere in the future. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.